Eli and Marcus started the same job the same week, same salary, same desk row. 5 years later, Marcus pulls into the office lot in a car 2 years old, financed, immaculate, and two coworkers walk over just to look at it. Eli parks the same beat-up sedan he's had since college 2 spots down. Nobody looks twice. Here's the number that should stop you mid-scroll. Marcus's actual net worth, once you subtract what he owes on the car, the furniture, and the balance he carries on 2 cards, sits close to zero. Eli's, quietly built the entire time nobody was looking, is well into 6 figures. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't about Marcus being reckless or Eli being a genius. It's about a specific, predictable mechanism, the fact that looking like you're winning and actually winning pull money in exactly opposite directions, and almost nobody notices which one they're actually optimizing for. This isn't a video telling you to drive a bad car or never enjoy your money. It's a video about the gap between the signal and the substance, and what that gap is quietly costing the people who never stop to check which side of it they're standing on. Let me show you the math. My name is Alex, and I spend a genuinely unreasonable amount of time looking at where people's money quietly vanishes to, and sometimes, at where it quietly grows while nobody's watching. If you've ever felt behind because someone else's life looked more impressive than yours, hit subscribe, because today on Wealth Adjacent we're taking apart the difference between looking rich and actually being it. Before we go further, a quick disclaimer. I'm not a financial advisor, this isn't financial advice, and I am not telling anyone to live like a monk or never enjoy the money they work for. What I am here to do is separate 2 things that get treated as the same thing constantly, spending in a way that signals success, and actually having it, because confusing those 2 categories is one of the more expensive mistakes a person can make without ever noticing they're making it. Let's introduce someone. Eli, early 30s, works in logistics, has driven the same reliable car for 9 years now, and genuinely doesn't think about it much anymore. He's not secretly wealthy in some dramatic hidden fortune sense at all. He's just been doing one specific thing consistently since his first real paycheck, and it's the thing almost nobody notices because it produces absolutely nothing visible. Let's start with the number, because it is genuinely a little unhinged. Research on household net worth consistently finds that a meaningful share of people who display the clearest visible markers of wealth, new vehicles, high-end wardrobes, expensive nightly outings, carry the least amount of actual net worth once debt is subtracted, while a large share of people with genuinely high net worth live in ordinary homes, drive older vehicles, and are functionally invisible to anyone estimating their finances from the outside. Let me say that again. The visible signal of wealth and the actual presence of wealth are, statistically, close to unrelated, and in a meaningful number of cases, they point in opposite directions entirely. Where does that disconnect actually come from? Financing makes the appearance of wealth available to almost anyone regardless of their actual financial position, a car loan, a store credit card, a buy now pay later plan, all of which let someone project a level of spending their real numbers don't support. Meanwhile, the people quietly accumulating actual net worth are, by definition, doing the opposite of what produces a visible signal. They're not spending the money, which means there's nothing for anyone watching to notice at all. And here's the part that should make you sit up. Multiple studies comparing self-reported financial confidence against actual net worth find people consistently misjudge both their own position and other people's, specifically because visible spending gets treated as reliable evidence of financial health when it's actually one of the weaker signals available. Someone spending confidently in front of you is giving you almost no real information about whether they can actually afford it. But spending money itself isn't the trap. Buying something nice is just buying something nice. Here's where it becomes a trap. A significant share of people report making a major purchase, a car, a wardrobe refresh, a lifestyle upgrade, at least partly because of how it would be perceived by others, rather than purely for personal use or need. And the genuinely uncomfortable stat sitting right next to it, people who report frequently comparing their spending to peers or social media are considerably more likely to report carrying consumer debt, and considerably less likely to report meeting their own savings goals. Read that twice. The comparison itself isn't neutral, it's actively correlated with the exact financial outcomes people are trying to avoid by making the comparison in the first place. Back to Marcus. His car payment runs several $100s a month. Add the interest on 2 credit cards he's been carrying a balance on for over a year, plus a lease on an apartment slightly nicer than his budget really supports. And the math is simple. There's very little left at the end of most months, and what is left tends to disappear into something unplanned. He's not reckless in any dramatic sense, He just consistently makes the version of every decision that looks a little better from the outside, and those small decisions compound in exactly the opposite direction that actual wealth does. None of it feels like a single bad decision in the moment. It feels like a series of completely reasonable ones, which is exactly what makes the pattern so easy to miss until years have already passed. He is not the exception. Most people carrying consumer debt report their monthly spending decisions are influenced at least somewhat by how their life appears to others. Even when asked directly, most also say that appearance shouldn't logically matter as much as it does. Now here's the part that turns this from a spending problem into a psychology problem. And this is the part that should genuinely fascinate you once you see it clearly. Spending money to look successful produces an almost immediate social reward, a compliment, a glance, a reaction, something your brain registers right away. Investing the same money produces no comparable immediate reward at all. Nobody notices a transfer into an index fund. There's no reaction to collect. The reward for that decision is real, but it's delayed, often by years, which puts it at a fundamental disadvantage against anything that pays off socially in the same afternoon. A researcher studying present bias applied to social spending found something almost too honest. People consistently underweight, delayed, invisible financial rewards specifically because the brain evolved to respond strongly to immediate social feedback, a bias that made sense for most of human history and now runs directly counter to how actual wealth gets built in a credit-based economy. The bias isn't a personal failing, it's a mismatch between an old wiring pattern and a new financial environment. There's a specific reason humans are so bad at estimating other people's actual wealth from visible cues. And it isn't a lack of intelligence. For most of history, producing a visible symbol of status genuinely required real resources, so the signal was mostly reliable. That correlation quietly broke somewhere in the last few decades, once financing made the appearance available to almost anyone regardless of their actual position, but the instinct to read visible spending as a reliable signal never got updated to match. People are, in a sense, running an outdated piece of mental software that made sense in a world without 7-year auto loans and instant credit approval, and applying it to a world that no longer works that way. And then there's the specific mechanism that makes this particular pattern so persistent. Visible spending creates a feedback loop that invisible saving simply can't compete with. One purchase gets noticed, which reinforces the next one, while months of consistent saving produce no comparable feedback at any point along the way, which means the behavior that actually builds wealth has to be sustained entirely on its own logic, with zero social reinforcement helping it along. Now, before we go further, we still haven't gotten to the specific patterns that quietly separate visible spenders from quiet builders in ways most people never examine directly. Hold that thought. Because first, the smaller signals. Let's talk about the phrase that should trigger alarm bells the moment it shows up in your own head. I've earned this. That phrase isn't always wrong, but it gets used constantly to greenlight a purchase that was actually driven by wanting to be seen a certain way, rather than by genuine need or planned enjoyment. And the two motivations produce very different long-term outcomes even when the receipt looks identical. Then there's the financed status symbol pattern, where the monthly payment, not the actual price, becomes the only number that gets evaluated before a purchase. A car that only costs a few $100s a month feels completely different from the same car's actual 5-figure price tag, even though the total cost, plus interest, is identical either way, just spread out in a form that's easier to approve of in the moment. There's a social media amplification version of this pattern too, worth naming specifically. Curated online lifestyles create a constant, unrealistic comparison baseline, since what gets posted is almost always the highlight, the new purchase, the nice night out, never the credit card statement behind it. Comparing your actual financial reality against someone else's curated highlight reel isn't a fair comparison in either direction, but it happens constantly, and it quietly recalibrates what feels like a normal amount to spend. And then, the layer that catches people hardest, lifestyle creep tied specifically to income increases, where a raise gets absorbed almost entirely into a slightly nicer version of everything, a nicer apartment, a nicer car, more frequent nights out, rather than into savings or investments, meaning the actual gap between income and net worth barely closes even as income climbs steadily higher year after year. There's a risk exposure version of this pattern worth naming too, one that goes beyond the purely financial. Visible spending doesn't just fail to signal wealth reliably, It can actively create exposure that quiet accumulation avoids. People who present as having disposable income tend to get treated differently by salespeople, push toward upgrades and add-ons more aggressively, and are statistically more likely to be approached by others for loans or financial favors, simply because the visible signal suggests the capacity exists, whether or not it actually does. None of this is anyone's fault for spending money. It's just a quiet cost of visibility that almost never gets factored into the original purchase decision. The same pattern shows up in small business ownership too, worth a brief mention since it plays out identically outside of personal spending. A business that reinvests steadily, avoids unnecessary debt, and doesn't spend aggressively on appearances tends to survive downturns that sink flashier competitors who financed their growth and their image at the same aggressive pace. The quiet business and the loud one can look, from the outside, like the loud one is winning, right up until the first bad quarter reveals which one actually had a real foundation underneath the appearance. Alright, here's the section nobody wants anywhere near a calculator when a nicer car just showed up in the office parking lot. Let's do this through Eli and Marcus together, because abstract numbers slide right off the brain. Both started at $90,000 a year exactly. Marcus's visible spending, the car, the apartment upgrade, the wardrobe, the nights out, consistently leaves him with close to nothing at the end of most months. Eli, driving the same 9-year-old car the entire time, has been investing a meaningful share of every paycheck since year one. Left alone for 10 years at a conservative return, that consistent gap compounds into a genuinely enormous difference, not a difference of a few $1,000s, a difference that changes what both of their next 10 years actually look like. Here's the framework I want you to carry around. Visible spending and actual wealth pull directly against each other, because every dollar spent to look successful is a dollar that can no longer compound toward actually being successful. The real question was never, does this make my life look impressive? It's, does this genuinely improve my life, independent of who's watching? And now here's where it gets almost cruel. If visible spending reliably signaled actual financial strength, treating it as useful information would make sense. It doesn't, reliably. Research comparing visible consumption against measured net worth finds close to no meaningful positive correlation between the two, and in several studies, a mild negative one, meaning the flashier the visible signal, on average, the weaker the actual financial position tends to be standing behind it. Now, let me keep my promise, because I am not telling anyone that spending money or enjoying nice things is inherently wrong. I can already hear the objections, because I get them every time I make a video like this. First, but enjoying your money is part of the point of earning it, isn't that worth something? Completely fair and genuinely true, spending isn't the enemy here. But notice the actual distinction being made. Spending driven by genuine enjoyment is a completely different decision than spending driven by how it will be perceived, even when the two produce an identical receipt. Second, but some visible spending, a good car, decent clothes for work, is genuinely necessary, not vanity. Also fair, and worth naming directly, necessity and status signaling frequently overlap in the same purchase, which is exactly why the useful question isn't whether to spend at all, but which version, and at which price point, actually serves the need versus the appearance. The actual answer was never spend nothing or hide all your money forever. It's know which motivation is actually driving each purchase, because only one of them compounds. There's a third point worth naming honestly too. This isn't an argument for total invisibility or refusing to ever share good news with people who care about you. Genuine connection, celebrating real milestones with people who matter, is a completely different thing from broadcasting a curated lifestyle to an audience of strangers or acquaintances for validation. The distinction isn't visible versus invisible, it's audience versus no audience, and specifically whether the purchase decision itself was shaped by the presence of that audience in the first place. So here's the framework I'd actually use. I call it the audience check, and you can run it on any significant purchase in under a minute. Ask directly, would I still want this exact thing, at this exact price, if literally nobody else would ever see it or know I had it? If the honest answer is yes, that's a purchase driven by genuine value. If the honest answer changes meaningfully once you imagine nobody watching, that's a signal, not a need, and worth pausing on before committing real money to it. A few practical moves fall out of that. Automate investing the same week any raise arrives, before lifestyle has a chance to expand to fill the new number. Evaluate purchases on total price, not monthly payment, since financing structure changes how affordable something feels without changing what it actually costs. Notice specifically when a spending decision is happening right after scrolling social media, since that's exactly when the comparison baseline gets most distorted. And let some purchases stay genuinely private, not because you're hiding anything, but because not every good decision needs an audience to be worth making. So here's where we land, plainly. This isn't a story about Marcus being irresponsible or Eli being unusually disciplined in some rare, unreachable way. It's a story about two decisions that look almost identical from month to month, but compound in completely opposite directions over years, one visible and immediately rewarding, one invisible and only rewarding much later. The data doesn't say spending money is a mistake. What it says is quieter and far more useful. The version of you that looks successful and the version of you that actually is are frequently working against each other, and only one of them shows up on a balance sheet 10 years from now. And if you're standing in a parking lot right now, quietly comparing your own car, your own apartment, your own life to someone else's, hear this clearly. You're not behind, and you're not less impressive. You might be looking at someone whose visible life is actively working against their own future, while your unremarkable one is quietly building something real. Of course, the comparison feels convincing. It's built to feel that way. Seeing what it actually measures is most of the battle. So Eli keeps driving the same car, not out of stubbornness, but because he ran the numbers years ago and never found a reason to change the answer. Marcus, eventually, starts asking the audience check question before his next purchase, and slowly the gap starts closing, not because he stopped enjoying his money, but because he started noticing which purchases were actually for him, and which ones had quietly been for an audience he couldn't even name if you asked him. Spend on what genuinely improves your life. Skip the version that was only ever meant for an audience that, honestly, was never paying as much attention as it felt like they were. And the next time someone else's life looks more impressive than yours, remember, you're only ever seeing the signal. You have no idea what the substance underneath it actually looks like. If this helped, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever bought something mainly because of how it would look to other people? And did you notice it at the time, or only looking back? I'll see you in the next one.